Evelyn Hart had always believed that love, when true, was not loud but patient, like the quiet blooming of wildflowers in spring. She was 20 when she met Michael Turner, a man whose presence was as gentle as the wind that swept across the meadows of their small towns. He wasn't the kind of man who filled a room with charm. Rather, he filled the spaces between words with meaning. Their first meeting was nothing out of a storybook. No candlelight, no music, no grand gestures. Evelyn had been struggling to carry boxes into her late father's old bookstore when Michael stopped to help. He smiled shyly, his hands dusty from repairing fences at a nearby farm. "Books are heavier than secrets." He joked softly, and she laughed, a sound that stayed with him. That day, under the shade of a large willow tree near the bookstore, something wordless passed between them. Something both fragile and enduring. Weeks turned into months. Michael began to visit the bookstore more often, bringing her wildflowers, sometimes old poetry books he'd found in flea markets. Evelyn loved how he spoke little but listened deeply. He'd ask about her dreams, her fears, her late father's favorite authors. He never pretended to know everything. He only made her feel seen. And in a world that so often ignored her quiet strength, that was everything. One evening, as the sun melted into gold and the world seemed at peace, Michael took her hand and led her back to that same willow tree. "If we're ever lost," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "we'll meet here in silence, no words, no explanations. Just 1 minute of silence to find each other again." Evelyn smiled, her eyes glistening. "Then promise me," she whispered, "that you'll always come back to me, even if it's only in silence." That was the beginning of their forever. They married a year later in a small church, filled with the scent of lilies and laughter. Their wedding wasn't extravagant, but every detail felt sacred. Her mother's lace veil, his trembling hands as he slipped the ring onto her finger, the single tear that rolled down his cheek when he said, "I do." The world outside faded in that moment. It was just the two of them, Evelyn and Michael, bound by love, not perfection. The years unfolded gently. They built a modest home at the edge of town, surrounded by roses and that same old willow tree that had witnessed the start of their story. Michael worked tirelessly, eventually opening a small construction business. Evelyn ran the bookstore, which became more than just a place of stories. It was a corner of peace for anyone who entered. Together, they created a life rich in small joys. Morning coffee shared in silence, handwritten notes left on the kitchen table, the familiar sound of his laughter echoing through their evenings. Life wasn't without its storms. There were times when money ran thin, when arguments flickered like small fires between them, when illness shadowed their joy. But each time they returned to each other, always to the willow tree, always to silence. That was their ritual. Whenever things felt too heavy for words, they'd sit beneath its branches, holding hands, saying nothing. The silence spoke for them. It healed, forgave, and reminded them of the promise they'd made long ago. 40 years passed like a whisper. Their children grew, married, and moved away. The town changed, technology replaced simplicity, but their love remained untouched, steady as ever. Michael's hair turned silver. Evelyn's hands grew soft with age, but the tenderness between them never dimmed. They'd walk through the garden every evening, laughing at memories, teasing each other about growing old. Evelyn often caught herself watching him when he didn't notice. The way his eyes still searched for her in a crowd, the way he hummed their favorite tune under his breath. Sometimes she wondered how she had been so lucky to have found a love that didn't fade but deepened with time. One evening on their 40th wedding anniversary, Michael surprised her with a picnic beneath the willow tree. Lanterns glowed softly, and the scent of roses filled the air. He took her hands, still trembling, just like years ago, and said, "Evelyn, do you remember our promise?" She smiled. "How could I forget?" He nodded slowly. "If ever we're lost, meet me here in silence." They shared laughter, memories, and a slow dance under the stars. The night was perfect, too perfect, as if time itself wanted to capture their love in one final frame. Evelyn didn't know it then, but this would be the last night they'd sit beneath the willow together. When the dawn broke the next morning, the world looked the same. but her life was about to shatter. Michael kissed her forehead before leaving for work, whispering, "I'll be back before lunch." She smiled, watching him go, never realizing that those would be the last words she'd ever hear from him. As the sun climbed high, Evelyn brewed 2 cups of coffee, one for him, one for herself, waiting, unaware that destiny had already rewritten their story. Under the willow, their promise lingered, a silent witness to a love about to be tested by loss. The morning after their 40th anniversary glowed with the warmth of a perfect summer day. The air smelled faintly of roses and dew, and sunlight spilled gently through the lace curtains of Evelyn's kitchen. She hummed while pouring 2 cups of coffee, one for herself, one for Michael. It had been their ritual for 40 years. Michael kissed her on the forehead before leaving for work, just as he always did. Back before lunch, he promised. His voice steady, his eyes soft with affection. Evelyn smiled and waved from the porch, watching his car disappear down the winding road. She didn't know that this was the last time she would ever see him alive. Hours passed quietly. She arranged flowers, dusted shelves at the bookstore, and thought about how lucky she was. But as noon came and went, a faint unease began to stir in her chest. Michael was never late without calling. She dialed his number, once, twice, 3 times. Each call went unanswered. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, that maybe he'd just been caught up in work, but by 3 p.m., the sun felt colder and her heart beat heavier. Then the phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm, too calm. "Mrs. Turner. This is St. Mary's Hospital. There's been an accident. We need you to come immediately." The world fell silent around her. The clock on the wall ticked louder than ever before, every second slicing through her heart. She grabbed her coat, her keys trembling in her hands, and rushed to the car. The road to the hospital felt endless, her eyes clouded by tears that refused to fall. When she arrived, the white walls and smell of antiseptic hit her like a wave of dread. A nurse with kind eyes led her down a hallway. "He was brought in from the highway," she whispered softly. "A collision. We did everything we could." Evelyn's knees weakened. "Can I see him?" she managed to ask. The nurse nodded. The room was quiet, painfully so. Michael lay on the hospital bed, peaceful, almost as if asleep. His face was unmarked, serene, but his chest no longer rose with breath. Evelyn stood frozen at the doorway, her mind refusing to believe what her eyes saw. She walked closer, trembling, her fingers brushing against his hand. It was cold. "Michael," she whispered. "Wake up, you promised." Her voice broke into the emptiness. She wanted to scream, to tear the silence apart, but no sound came. Only her breath, shallow, broken. She pressed her forehead against his and wept soundlessly. That 1 minute beside him felt like eternity. It was the minute that stopped time. When everything she was collapsed into grief. When the doctor came in to offer words of comfort, she barely heard them. "It was instant," he said. "No pain." But Evelyn felt pain enough for both of them. Later, as she sat in the hospital corridor, numb and empty, she overheard 2 officers speaking in hushed tones. "Strange crash," one said. "Brake lines cut clean. Doesn't look accidental." The words hit her like lightning. Brake lines cut. Her tears froze. Her grief began to twist into confusion, and confusion into something darker. At the funeral, people came with flowers, prayers, and rehearsed sympathies. The town mourned the man who had helped rebuild their homes, who had given without asking for anything in return. Evelyn stood beside the coffin, staring at the man she had loved for 40 years. Every word spoken around her sounded distant, meaningless. When the pastor asked for a moment of silence, Evelyn's world slowed. She bowed her head and closed her eyes, not for prayer, not for farewell, but for a promise. 1 minute of silence. It was the vow they'd made under the willow tree so many years ago. If we ever get lost, we'll meet in silence. And so she stood there, not crying, not moving, not breathing, only listening to the silence. To him, she felt the wind stir slightly through the open church doors. It brushed against her face, soft and familiar. For that single minute, she believed he was there, whispering, "Find the truth." When the minute passed, she opened her eyes. Something in her had changed. The woman who had entered the church in pieces now stood with a strange calm. Not peace, but purpose. After the funeral, As guests drifted away, Evelyn stayed behind. She placed a single rose on the coffin and whispered, "I'll find out what really happened, Michael, even if it takes the rest of my life." Outside, the willow tree swayed gently in the wind, its branches moving like ghosts. The promise they made beneath it had not died, it had transformed. In the days that followed, she received condolences, casseroles, and pity. But behind the quiet smiles and sympathetic eyes, Evelyn began to notice things. Robert Hale, Michael's business partner, avoided her gaze. Their accountant seemed unusually nervous. Some documents Michael had been working on disappeared from his office. Her grief sharpened into clarity. Michael's death wasn't an accident. Someone had wanted him gone. One night, unable to sleep, she sat by the window, clutching his wedding ring and staring into the darkness. "You always said I was stronger than I knew," she whispered. "You were right." And in that silence, she made her second promise. This one not of love, but of vengeance. If the first 40 years of her life had belonged to love, the years that followed would belong to silence. A silence that would speak louder than any scream. A silence that would bring justice. That night, beneath the pale moonlight, Evelyn Turner stopped being a grieving widow. She became a woman with a mission, a heartbroken soul who had lost everything except the will to uncover the truth. And in that 1 minute of silence, her war began. Days bled into weeks, and Evelyn's world became a blur of condolences, loneliness, and unanswered questions. The house that once echoed with laughter now felt suffocatingly silent. Every room carried traces of Michael. His favorite book stacked on the nightstand, the half-finished crossword puzzle on the kitchen table, his jacket still hanging by the door. But grief, like water, finds cracks to seep into, and soon Evelyn's sorrow began to fill with something darker, suspicion. She replayed the hospital words over and over in her mind. Break lines cut clean. The phrase refused to leave her. Who would want Michael dead? He was kind, humble, honest. A man who helped neighbors and never made enemies, or so she had believed. One evening she sat in Michael's office, surrounded by papers, invoices, and files from his construction company. The desk smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. She opened his drawers, searching for something. She didn't know what exactly, only that her heart told her the truth was hidden somewhere among the dust. Then she found it, a manila envelope labeled Hale & Co., private. Inside were copies of contracts, payment receipts, and letters signed by Robert Hale, Michael's closest friend and business partner. Evelyn's stomach tightened as she read through them. The numbers didn't add up. Money was missing, large amounts. Her breath caught when she found a letter written in Michael's handwriting, dated just 2 days before his death. "Robert, I can't stay quiet about this anymore. The company belongs to our workers too. They deserve the truth. I'll be meeting with the board next week." Her hands trembled. Michael had discovered something: corruption, fraud, maybe even betrayal. And before he could expose it, he died. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, the moonlight casting long shadows across the room. The silence was no longer comforting. It felt heavy, watchful. The next morning, she visited Robert Hale's office. He greeted her with that same polished smile he'd worn at the funeral, the kind that looked kind on the surface but hollow underneath. His suit was crisp, his voice soft, but his eyes flickered nervously when she mentioned Michael's name. "I just wanted to collect some of Michael's belongings," Evelyn said quietly, studying his expression. "He always said you were more like a brother than a business partner." Robert smiled tightly. He was a good man. "We miss him dearly." His tone was smooth, but Evelyn could hear the cracks beneath it. She noticed how his hands fidgeted with a pen, how he avoided meeting her eyes. She thanked him and left, but her heart was racing. She knew that look, guilt disguised as sympathy. Later that afternoon, Evelyn met with Daniel, one of Michael's former employees. He was a kind young man who had worked for them for years, but had disappeared after the accident. When she found him, he hesitated to talk, glancing around as if someone might be listening. "Mrs. Turner?" he whispered. "Mr. Hale told everyone not to speak about the company after what happened." "Why?" Evelyn asked softly. Daniel hesitated, then handed her a small USB drive. Because Michael was right. He found out they were using fake safety reports and overcharging city contracts. He wanted to report it, but then his voice broke. Then the brakes failed. Evelyn felt the ground shift beneath her. The truth was there, tangled, dirty, and dangerous. When she returned home, she plugged the USB in her computer. Files opened, evidence of corruption, illegal contracts, forged signatures. Robert Hale had been stealing from the company for years, using Michael's trust as his shield. And when Michael found out, he became a threat. Tears blurred her vision. "You killed him," she whispered into the quiet rooms. "You killed the only good man I ever knew." But crying wouldn't bring him back, and Michael wouldn't have wanted her to live in despair. He had always said, if you can't speak with words, speak with silence. Silence is stronger than rage. So Evelyn began to plan. She started attending community meetings, quietly asking questions, pretending to be the grieving widow who was just handling the business. She met with lawyers, accountants, and even an old detective friend who had known Michael for years. Each conversation gave her another piece of the puzzle. At night, she would sit under the willow tree, her late husband's photograph in her lap. "I'm getting closer," she whispered. "Just hold on a little longer." The wind rustled through the branches as if answering her. Weeks turned into months. Evelyn learned how to hide her pain behind polite smiles. When people pitied her, she nodded softly, thanked them, and kept her silence. But behind those calm eyes was a storm gathering strength. Robert Hale still visited sometimes, pretending to check on her, pretending to care. "If you ever need anything," he would say. Evelyn would smile sweetly and reply, "You've done enough already." She started recording their conversations, tracking his financial activities, and collecting every trace of evidence that could tie him to Michael's death. The woman who had once lived for love was gone. In her place stood someone new, sharp, composed, and quietly dangerous. Late one evening, as she closed Michael's silence, it had become Evelyn's closest companion, not empty silence, but one filled with purpose. For months, she had played her role perfectly, the fragile widow, the grieving soul who couldn't move on. But beneath that calm surface, a plan had begun to bloom, precise, patient, and merciless. Each morning, she'd dress in her usual gray sweater, serve herself a single cup of coffee, and visit the garden. To the neighbors, she seemed lost in memories. To Robert Hale, she appeared broken and harmless. But behind those soft, tearful eyes lived a woman who now understood the cost of trust and the price of vengeance. Evelyn knew she couldn't fight him with brute force or rage. Men like Robert thrived on chaos, on people's emotional mistakes. She would destroy him the way he had destroyed her, quietly, perfectly, with no warning until it was too late. The first step was patience. She spent nights combing through Michael's files, learning everything about the company's operations, clients, and bank accounts. Her husband had left clues everywhere, numbers scribbled in old notebooks, highlighted contracts, even names she'd never noticed before. Slowly, she built a map of his world, connecting dots that others had missed. The second step was infiltration. Evelyn called Robert one morning, her voice soft but firm. "Robert," she said, "I can't keep the company closed forever. Michael would have wanted it to stay alive. I'll need your help to manage things until I'm ready." There was a pause on the other end, then Robert's voice, careful but pleased. "Of course, Evelyn, you can count on me." That was the beginning of his end. For weeks they worked together, or so he believed. Robert showed her the books, the projects, the future plans. Evelyn nodded, listened, and smiled. She played the knave widow, asking innocent questions while secretly recording every meeting. Each polite conversation became a trap. Each email she sent was bait. In the evenings, she met quietly with Daniel, the young employee who had once given her the USB drive. Together, they organized the documents, collected copies, traced bank transfers, and recorded phone calls. Evelyn worked like a detective, never sleeping until the truth formed a perfect pattern of guilt. One night, she stared at her reflection in the mirror. "You've waited long enough," she whispered. "It's time?" The next day, she invited Robert to her home, the same home where Michael had spent his last morning. She served tea in porcelain cups, smiling kindly. "You've been so helpful, Robert," she said, her tone honeyed. "I wanted to thank you properly?" Robert smiled, leaning back in his chair. "It's the least I could do, Evelyn. Michael was my friend." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "A friend?" she asked softly. "Then why did you cut his brakes?" The smile on Robert's face froze. His eyes widened, just slightly, but enough. "Excuse me?" he said, forcing a laugh. Evelyn leaned forward, her voice calm but sharp as glass. "I know everything, Robert. The forged contracts, the hidden accounts, the money you stole from the city. Michael found out, and you couldn't let him talk. He started to protest, but she interrupted. Don't lie. I have recordings, bank records, witnesses. You didn't just kill my husband. You tried to erase his life's work." Robert's hand trembled slightly as he set down his cup. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said. Evelyn smiled, the same way Michael used to when he knew he was right. "I know enough, and I also know the police will be very interested in what I've found." She stood, walking to the window. Outside, the willow tree swayed in the evening wind. "You know," she said quietly, "Michael and I used to sit under that tree whenever words failed us. 1 minute of silence. That's what we promised each other. 1 minute to remember, to forgive, or to decide." She turned back to him. "I think you owe him that minute." Robert's face paled. "What are you talking about?" Evelyn walked toward him, her eyes unblinking. "Sit," she commanded softly. "For 1 minute. Don't speak. Don't move. Just remember what you did." He hesitated but sat, whether from fear or guilt she couldn't tell. She set a small timer on the table and pressed the button. The ticking filled the room. For 60 seconds, neither spoke. Evelyn stood still, her gaze fixed on him. The air felt heavy, suffocating. When the timer beeped, Robert's hands were shaking. "That's how long it took." Evelyn whispered. 1 minute. "That's how long it took for my husband's car to lose control. 1 minute, and 40 years of love were gone." Robert opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the sound of sirens pierced the air. He turned toward the window in horror. Evelyn smiled faintly. "I called them before you arrived," she said softly. "You see, silence is powerful, but it's not empty. It's full of truth waiting for the right moment to be heard." The police entered moments later, finding Robert pale and trembling. As they handcuffed him, Evelyn said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence said everything. When the door finally closed behind them, she walked to the willow tree outside. The evening light bathed her face in gold and shadow. She closed her eyes, feeling the wind brush against her skin. For the first time in months, her heart felt light. She had done it. Not with rage, not with violence, but with silence and patience. Michael would have understood. As the branches swayed above her, Evelyn whispered, "It's done, my love. Justice. Quiet, but complete." And the willows seemed to whisper back. 1 minute of silence. The morning after Robert Hale's arrest was unusually quiet. The world outside Evelyn's window glimmered with a strange calm, the kind that follows a long storm. The air felt lighter, almost forgiving. The birds sang. The garden swayed in the breeze, and for the first time in months, Evelyn didn't feel like a ghost in her own home. The news had spread quickly across town. Local businessmen charged with corruption and murder conspiracy. Reporters camped outside her gate. Neighbors whispered her name with both sympathy and awe. To everyone else, Evelyn Turner had become a symbol of courage, a widow who uncovered the truth behind her husband's death. But inside, she felt neither heroic nor victorious. Justice, she realized, didn't bring peace. It only opened the door to grief she had been too busy to feel. That evening, she sat alone in Michael's office. The documents that had once haunted her now rested neatly in a box, sealed and labeled for the police. The room was tidy but empty, a hollow reminder that her mission, her reason to wake up each morning, was finally over. She looked around slowly. His pen still lay beside the notepad. His jacket hung by the door. On the wall was the framed photograph of their wedding day. 2 young faces full of hope, unaware of how cruel time could be. Evelyn touched the photo gently, her fingertips tracing his smile. "You can rest now," she whispered. "It's finished." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. The world might have found closure, but her heart was still bound by 40 years of love. And the silence that followed. Later that night she walked into the garden. The moon was full, casting silver light across the grass. The willow tree, their willow, stood tall and watchful, its long branches swaying softly in the breeze. Evelyn walked closer, each step heavy with memories. She knelt beneath it, the earth cool beneath her hands. This was where it had all begun, their first promise, their last dance, and the place where she had kept her soul anchored when everything else had fallen apart. She placed a small wooden box at the tree's roots. Inside were the things she held closest: Michael's wedding ring, a folded letter he had written years ago, and a small silver watch he'd worn every day. I kept my promise," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I found the truth. I made them listen. But now I think it's time to let go." A soft wind rustled through the branches as if answering her. Evelyn leaned back against the tree trunk and closed her eyes. For a moment she imagined Michael sitting beside her, just as he had done countless times before, his hand warm in hers, his smile quiet, his voice low. "I'm proud of you," he would say. "You were always stronger than you believed." She could almost hear him laugh, see the crinkle near his eyes, smell the faint scent of his cologne mixed with the summer air. The memory was so vivid it hurt. Tears filled her eyes, not of anger this time, but of release. She had lived through love, loss, and vengeance, but now she craved peace. Evelyn looked up at the sky. "Do you remember our promise?" she whispered. "If we ever get lost, we'll meet again in silence." She took a deep breath, then set her watch on the ground and pressed the button on its small timer. 1 minute. The ticking began. In that minute, she didn't think of Robert Hale, or the trial that would follow, or the curious eyes of the world. She thought only of Michael. The way his voice softened when he said her name, the way his laughter could chase away her fears, the way his silence had always meant safety, not absence. As the seconds passed, memories flooded her. Their wedding day, their children's laughter, the smell of books in the shop, the sound of rain on their roof, the feel of his heartbeat when she rested against his chest. Each memory was a whisper in the wind, each second a heartbeat that no longer belonged to sorrow. When the final second ticked away, the timer beeped softly. Evelyn smiled. 1 minute, she said aloud. Or a minute. She wiped her tears, feeling a strange stillness within her, not emptiness, but peace. She knew Michael was gone, but she no longer felt the sharp ache of separation. His presence was everywhere, in the whispering willow, in the quiet hum of the night, in her own heartbeat. As dawn began to rise, she stood and brushed the soil from her hands. The horizon glowed faintly pink, the beginning of another day. She turned back toward the house, pausing only once to glance over her shoulder. "Goodbye, my love," she said softly. "And thank you for 40 years of love and 1 minute of silence." Then she walked away slowly, her figure fading into the golden light of morning. The willow tree swayed, its leaves shimmering as if in farewell. And for a fleeting moment, if anyone had been there to listen, they might have heard a man's faint laughter carried by the wind, tender, proud, eternal. Evelyn never remarried. She lived quietly, tending to her garden, reading by the window, writing letters she never sent. But every year, on the anniversary of Michael's death, she returned to the willow tree. She would sit there in silence for exactly 1 minute, her tribute, her ritual, her promise kept. And each time the air around her would grow still, the world pausing just long enough to honor what they had shared. A love that survived time, loss, and vengeance. In the end, Evelyn Turner didn't die of sorrow. She lived long enough to be remembered not as a widow, not as a victim, but as a woman who turned her pain into power and her silence into strength. When she finally passed away, they buried her beneath the willow next to Michael. And as the wind whispered through the leaves, it carried a sound softer than breath, older than grief, the sound of two souls keeping their final promise. 1 minute of silence.